Welcome to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Our host is Dave Garrison from Ohio Christian University, a longtime Fortune 100 company top executive and a former U.S. congressional candidate from Texas. Our goal for the Faith and Liberty Talk Show is to give you an opportunity to listen to interviews and discussions with significant authorities and experts on subjects related to Christians engaging in the civil and political arena. The mission of the show is to give you real information and not sound bites that you can really use. We have a website for the show, faithandliberty.org. At this website, you can obtain more information about the show, our guests, subscribe to our newsletter, and become a friend of the show, and like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page. You can also access all of our previous shows. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If our show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. Now, let's begin today's show. Thank you for joining us.
Well, we're here today with a guest that we've been trying to get on the show for a year, and he's been so gracious to join us. His website calls him atheist-turned-Christian Lee Strobel. Lee is the former award-winning legal editor of the Chicago Tribune and some other papers you were a reporter for too, weren't you, Lee?
Yes, I was editor of a newspaper down in Missouri, in Columbia, Missouri, and assistant managing editor of the Daily Herald, which is the third largest newspaper in Illinois.
Oh, yes, and someone who lived his first part of his life in Illinois. I know the Chicago Tribune real well. I guess they're not what they used to be, are they?
Well, no newspaper is
Really?
anymore. I mean, back when I was at the Tribune, our circulation daily was about 810,000.
Yeah.
I think it's about half that now.
Yeah, I was in Chicago this past weekend and saw the building and went, whoa. Lee's also, listeners, been on ABC, Fox, PBS, CNN, and I would imagine that there are very few Christians in America that don't know he's a New York Times best-selling author of many books. And Lee, you're over 20 books now, haven't you written?
Yeah, I mean, if you add them all up with co-authorship and stuff like that, it's about 40.
Wow, that's
so
amazing.
It's been busy, but that's my background in writing, so it's I'm comfortable as a writer.
Well, I admire what you've been doing, and we're going to get into it later in the show because when you write and you write on the truth, there are those who don't like it very much, and we'll
Right.
get into that as you and I talked before the show, having run for Congress and then now doing this conservative, faith-based talk show. We get messages, and we had a real nasty one today from a skater, which I didn't realize how that, what we'd call it, equated to what his issues were. But in any event, you know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
Now, some of the books, probably the one that really put you on the map was The Case for Christ, but you've done the God's Outrageous Claims, The Case for Christmas, The Case for Easter, What Jesus Would Say, Exploring the Da Vinci Code, Surviving Spiritual Mismatch in Marriage, which I believe you co-authored with your wife, right?
Right, that's right.
And you have a Master's of Journalism from University of Missouri and a Yale Law School Master's of Studies in Law degree.
Yeah, actually a bachelor's from Missouri and a Master of Studies in Law from Yale.
Okay, that's the way
Yep.
it is. Yeah, sure, of course.
Yep.
And then I think you've been honored other times with honorary doctorate degrees, like the one from Southern Evangelical Seminary.
Yeah, they were very kind to do that.
That's wonderful. And you have a son at Grand Canyon University. I think he's a PhD and a professor there.
Right, PhD in theology, and he's written several books already, popular level books as well as academic books.
Wow. So the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. That's great.
Well, my daughter is a novelist. She has 6 novels out.
I did hear that.
Yeah, 2 children's books. So
Yeah.
we're all kind of comfortable in the writing sphere.
And you've written some fiction yourself. I started on the trip the other day, The Ambition, and I think you're going to give Grisham a little run for his money in those kind of novels.
Well, I drew up for that novel from a lot of my experiences in Chicago when I covered the crime syndicate and political corruption cases for the Chicago Tribune when I was legal editor, and major trials of all sorts. And so I kind of spin a tale of corruption and judicial corruption and the crime syndicate and spiritual matters all kind of blended into one John Grisham-like novel.
That's great. Well, I hope you continue to write those.
Well, thanks.
We need that kind of bent. Unfortunately, and we're a little sidebar here, a lot of the best-known novelists, they have almost what I'll call a formula, where they got to throw in so much sex and so much other things. And it's great to hear from someone like you to write the story without having to do all that, but recognize the problems in legal and corruption and that sort of area.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, you don't have to go there. It's unfortunate that a lot of comedians go into material that's inappropriate for families when it's really not necessary, and I think the same is true for novelists often. So I wanted to write something that anybody could read and enjoy, and yet it's edgy in the sense of talking about serious matters like judicial corruption.
I was going to get to it later, but that kind of brings a question up for me, and that is, have you seen God's Not Dead yet?
You know, I saw a rough cut of that film when they were first making it, because I know the people who made it.
Well, they mention you in the movie. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, that's what I understand. The later edition, they added a quote from me or something.
Yeah, Yeah, you need to see it. And it's very interesting, Lee, that really the movie, to me, is about apologetics.
Yeah.
And I was glad to see that they mentioned your name and a couple of others for all the work that you've done. So let me ask you, just starting out, I know you've told your story, and most people have heard about your 2 years, what we call a journey in discovering, the truth of the Scriptures and the resurrection. You want to just state that in a brief form, because I'm sure most people, but just in case they haven't heard a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I was a skeptic for most of my life. With a background in journalism and law, you can imagine that. And my wife was sort of just spiritually confused about God. And I was, as you say, legal editor of the Chicago Tribune, and we moved into a condo outside Chicago, and the woman downstairs was a Christian, and she became best friends with my wife. And over the course of that relationship, she talked to her about Jesus and about faith, and went to church with her. And finally, after checking things out, she came up to me one day and told me that she'd become a Christian, which I thought was, bad news, being an atheist. But I saw positive changes in her character and values, and that's what encouraged me to use my legal training and journalism training to begin to investigate whether there's any credibility to any religion, much less Christianity.
Sure.
And so I launched on what turned out to be a nearly 2-year investigation of the historical evidence for Jesus, especially the resurrection of Jesus, since, as the Apostle Paul says, that's the linchpin of the Christian faith. If there is no resurrection, there is no Christian faith.
Absolutely.
So I focused a lot on that, as well as scientific evidence, cosmology, physics, biochemistry, genetics, human consciousness, the evidence from science that points in the direction of a God who looks amazingly like the God of the Bible.
Was it the evidence that caused you to come to Christ? And that's kind of a baited question, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. When you heard all this evidence from Gary Habermas and all the others, was that evidence sufficient to turn you to Christ?
Well, it was in the sense of...
In and of itself.
There is always a step of faith.
Right.
What I came down to was on November the 8th of 1981, when I realized that the evidence, in my view, is compelling that Jesus not only claimed to be the Son of God, but he backed it up by returning from the dead. When I came to that conclusion, I didn't quite know what to do, and then I remembered a Christian had pointed out a verse to me earlier, John 1:12, that says, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name." And so I realized that forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe plus receive equals become. So I believed, and that's great, but that wasn't enough. I had to receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased on the cross when he died for my sins. And when I would receive that free gift in repentance and faith, then I would become a child of God. And so that's when I confessed my sins, received forgiveness through Christ, and according to John 1:12, on that day became a child of God.
Yes, and we've heard that said many times. It worked for me, as you and I talked just a moment before the show, it was really an apologetics sermon that I heard that really made the difference for me. And then reading the scriptures, and when Jesus called Lazarus out of a tomb, and he'd been dead for 3 days, I mean, I just put the Bible down, and it just shocked me. And that's when I first started reading Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I know it sounds like for you, of course, and then for me and a lot of people that I know, and I'm getting to a question here eventually. The lawyer in me just keeps talking, I guess, and the professor. Those evidences often trigger a mechanism. But before we get into the value of apologetics, for the listeners' benefit, how do you define apologetics? Because we're going to be using that all through this talk of ours.
Yeah, it's from a Greek word that means to defend or to present a case for. And so apologetics, rather than apologizing for something, really means that we offer a defense of why we believe what we believe. 1
Peter 3:15.
Yeah, 1 Peter 3:15 is one verse that's often cited. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, and to do it gently and respectfully. We also have Jude 3 that tells us to contend earnestly for the faith. Titus 1:9 makes it a requirement for church leaders to be able to encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. He talks about in Philippians 1, verse 7, that he was active in defending and confirming the gospel, and describes in Acts 28:23 his last days in Rome, working from morning to evening as he tried to convince them about Jesus from the law of Moses and from the prophets. So we've got several directives and illustrations from the New Testament that make it an imperative for Christians to be able to define and defend what we believe. And especially in this increasingly skeptical generation, this is often a path that God uses to bring people to faith.
Well, the one verse that always jumps out at me, and I'd like to hear your comments on this, because I've used it a lot in my classes, where in Acts 17:11, it's recorded, "Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so." I think some people feel like, some Christians, too much of an examination or too much emphasis on apologetics means a lack of faith. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it depends on, we have to understand what faith is. And I think, we have the example, especially of Paul talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, about the importance of the resurrection, the importance of evidence historically for Jesus rising from the dead, the fact that he cites it in 1 Corinthians 15, and starting at verse 3, shows us that the evidence is important. Christianity is unique because it is a testable religion. It's an investigatable religion. It invites people to examine the scriptures and to explore it. Now, I think people can misunderstand and think we can argue someone into the kingdom of God. I don't think we can do that, but I think we can point them in a direction, and then they take a step of faith in the same direction that the evidence is pointing, which is what we do every day in a variety of ways in our lives. And that's logical, and that's rational, and it's biblical.
This is Dave Garrison. We're here with this week's guest, Lee Strobel, and we'll return after a few messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
This is Dave Garrison, and we return now with this week's guest, Lee Strobel, and continue our discussion. You know, there are a lot of people, and I heard you talk about this a little bit on a podcast with Dallas Seminary, about people that are reading Richard Dawkins' God Delusion and some of the other atheists out there. And so we're getting a lot more non-Christians or non-believers, whatever you want to call them, who are questioning us about this. Right. And I kind of feel like the majority of Christians that I know, and I've been in churches in Connecticut and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Texas and other places, people, the average Christian is not real adept at this, or is that just my anecdotal problem?
No, I think that's very true. I think the problem is that the church has kind of fallen down in the area of teaching doctrine and teaching apologetics over the last generation. And so when we've seen this rise of the so-called new atheists, who are really not offering new arguments, they're just getting more publicity and selling more books than they used to. What's happening is Christians aren't reading those books generally, but their friends are.
Right.
And their neighbors are, and their colleagues at work are, and fellow students are. And so they're challenging the Christians with the questions, what about this and what about that? And what's happening now is that people in the pews are asking their churches for help. And they're saying, we need training, we need instruction, we need education, we need to be more skilled at defending our faith, so help us. And so a lot of churches are doing sermon series on apologetics issues, and we see conferences from the East Coast to the West Coast, regional, national, local conferences on apologetics. I spoke to a conference for high school students on apologetics. We had over 2,000 high school students come and overflowed the facility at Focus on the Family with these young people who are really hungry to learn this stuff. Because why? Well, they're getting pressured from friends and others who are raising challenges, and they want to be secure in their own faith, but they want to reach their friends, and they're realizing to do that in the 21st century requires some knowledge of why we believe what we believe. So I think it's a positive trend that this is happening in the sense that it is bubbling up interest, and what we're seeing around the country, I think, is that we're on the cusp of a golden era in Christian apologetics. We've got some great young apologists who are developing, who are writing great books and new arguments and so forth. So I think it's an exciting time.
Oh, I do too. And your mind, my mind, you've been to law school, and I graduated from a law school in Texas, and it really is an amazing time. I was one of the top execs at USAA and retired there a couple of years ago. I'm sure you're familiar with them, living out in Colorado. One day, a friend of mine who was also one of our executives, he was driving to Houston, and he was listening to an audio book of the Da Vinci Code, and he called me all messed up. And fortunately, I had a little bit of understanding of what the issues were, and I explained to him how those writings had all come, a couple hundred years after Christ and all that sort of thing, and it calmed him down. But I just wonder if he didn't have somebody to go to talk about these things, where he would have gone. But let me ask you about this. Don't you think this opens up huge opportunities for Christian? Don't you think this is a wonderful time for us to get involved in apologetics and use this time?
Oh, absolutely. I think the opportunities are all over the place to get into conversations, to ask people what do they think, and listen to them, and to hear where they're coming from spiritually, but then to be able to offer opinions and evidence for why we believe what we believe, and get into a fruitful conversation about spiritual matters. I think it's very easy these days to do. There seems to be a receptivity to discussing these things. I'm always amazed that people who are not Christians are often the most interested in talking about spiritual matters. Some of my atheist friends want to talk about God more than they want to talk about atheism. It's amazing. So I think you're right. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to engage.
Especially when I was a few years ago working in these big corporations, they'd say, "Hey, can we go to lunch today?" And I thought, "Oh, okay, well that's nice." But that's what they wanted to talk about, because they find out that you're a believer and you've done various things. Some of them won't leave you alone because they have so many questions. So that brings me to something you mentioned, and I mentioned it to our pastor last week. He since listened to the podcast the same one I'm referring to in Dallas. And you talked about these small groups dedicated to apologetics with non-Christians. Will you explain that? Because, boy, he jumped on that and thought that was the greatest thing, because I do too.
Well, it is. I'm so excited about this development, and this is something that I've been involved with now for about 15 years. The way this works is that as people ask questions about spiritual matters, or they come to church and they're kind of checking things out if they're not believers, we try to unfold them into a sort of a spiritual discussion group. And usually it's led by a Christian and maybe an apprentice leader or maybe a spouse and maybe half a dozen non-believers. And during the course of meeting, say, once a week for a period of weeks, they address and talk about spiritual questions that they may have. And we have curricula that we've developed that some of the people go through. And
how would they find out about this curricula, Lee? Because we'll put a link up for the listeners.
Yeah, in fact, I just came out with a new one called 10 Toughest Questions About Christianity, I think it's called, that uses some video from my television show. I used to have a TV show called Faith Under Fire, where I would have debates between atheists and Christians and Baha'is and Muslims and all kinds of people on spiritual matters. And so we took the films of those and cut them down, and they provide great fodder for discussions in these little groups. It's called Exploring Christianity's 10 Toughest Questions.
Okay, great.
And that's one of several curricula that are available.
Okay.
And what we're finding is that when non-believers join these groups and they stay with them, that over a period of time, 80% come to faith in Christ. Now that is a testimony, I think, to a couple things. Number one, the power of the evidence, but number two, the willingness of people to have discussions and to engage in conversations about these matters, to dialogue about this stuff. And people are more than interested in getting in these groups. I mean, it's amazing how easy it is to invite friends and neighbors and colleagues and so forth into a group like this. So if people want to learn how to do a group like this, the guy who I hired when I was at Willow Creek Church in Chicago to head this up has become the world's leading expert on how to do these groups. And he's written a book about it. It's called Seeker Small Groups. And it's an A to Z guide on how to create a ministry like this at a church. We have it at our church. We did an event the other night called The Case for Easter, and I gave a talk on the evidence for Easter, and then we had Q&A. And at the end of that Q&A, we said, if you're here and you're not a believer, we have groups, and if you want to join a group and talk about this kind of stuff, we'd love to have you. And we unfolded a whole bunch of people into those groups. So if churches want to launch a ministry like that, or individuals want to do something like that, Gary Poole's books, Seeker Small Groups, is terrific.
Yeah, I think I have one of his, and I know Randy Frazie's been real good at some of those small group books. My son goes to Max Lucado and Randy's church, and
I've spoken there. It's a great church.
I know you have. I used to live 2 blocks behind his church there.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
What shocked me was when I was out there last time in Texas to speak out there, and they were telling me about the wild hogs that run wild out there in the country.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
I had never heard of that before.
I had to put up a 60-inch fence around my property to keep them from coming in, because there's millions and millions of feral hogs there. And
wow.
Yeah. Another area that really kind of grabs me, and I was mentioning this to some of the professors here at Ohio Christian University, and Lee, you might be interested to know that we make every student that comes to Ohio Christian University go through a Worldview course, a Christian Worldview course. We were in the past using Del Tackett's Truth Project, but now we're using some other things. And
Great.
It's remarkable to watch how these students will come in, and many of them are good Christian kids when they come in, but many, frankly, are not. And over the period of the time, because we really do spend a lot of time on apologetics, and every course that we teach is from a Christian worldview, but many of the students that have transferred here from other colleges, because they're just kind of tired of the other world or other worldviews, they felt like in those universities they're always on the defensive as Christians. And you and I are pretty close to the same age. Over my life, and I think you'll attest to this too, it used to be non-Christians were on the defensive. Now I
Yeah.
feel like the tables turned. Is that again another anecdotal issue? Or
I think there's some truth to that. They just came out with a study that showed that 19% of Americans are pretty hostile toward the Bible,
yeah,
and 19% are, big Bible lovers. So the Bible haters and the Bible lovers are about equal at about almost 20% of our culture today. That number of people who, quote unquote, hate the Bible has been increasing steadily over the last several years, I think from 10 to 19% over the last few years. So we are seeing an increase in people who are skeptical, and I think it's great that you do a worldview course. My son teaches the class in Christian Worldview at Grand Canyon University out in Phoenix, and it's so important to give people a solid grounding in why we believe what we believe, to prepare them for life and for engaging with people fruitfully in the 21st century.
This is Dave Garrison. We're here with this week's guest, Lee Strobel, and we'll return after a few messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
This is Dave Garrison, and we return now with this week's guest, Lee Strobel, and continue our discussion. I've been reading a fascinating book entitled The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Separated by Politics and Religion, by Jonathan Haidt. He's a pretty famous social psychologist. He's not a believer, but he makes some powerful observations between the differences between Christians, liberals, and conservatives. And have you thought much about why we're seeing these really big demarcations among groups?
Yeah, I just saw a study today that talked about the percentage of atheists who are in each political camp.
Right.
And that's a rather stark number. When you look, I'm just looking up the number here that I actually tweeted it and tweeted the numbers today. But if you look at, let me find it here.
Well, while you're doing that, the thing that I found remarkable when I ran for Congress in Texas a couple of years ago, I had hired Marco Rubio's campaign manager as my manager, and he told me, Dave, if you're not a Sunday school teacher in Texas as a Republican, you're probably not going to get elected.
That's probably true.
But here in Ohio and some of the other states up in this area, you'll find that many of the Republicans are conservatives fiscally only and not socially. It really varies across the country, so I'll bet you your stats are going to show something like that.
Right. This was a study at from Baylor University that shows that 9% of atheists identify as Republican, 46% of atheists describe themselves as Democrat, 29% say they're independent, and 16% say other, which is mostly libertarian.
Right.
So
yeah,
those are kind of stark percentages.
But as far as how atheists have developed, I heard you talk, and I'd like you to mention it again because I don't know all the details, about, I think he's a psychologist, Paul Vitz.
Yes, Paul Vitz is a psychologist at New York University who's written a book called Faith of the Fatherless based on his research. And it's fascinating in that he studied the lives of famous atheists through history. Camus, Sartre, Nietzsche, Freud, Madeleine Murray O'Hair, you just go down the line. And he found a commonality, and that is that their father either abandoned their family when they were young or died when they were young, or they had a terrible relationship with their dad. And the implication is that if you have abandonment issues with an earthly father, or you feel an earthly father has let you down in some way, then you're less likely to want to embrace a heavenly father. And so I think the father issue is significant, especially when you consider the increase in fatherlessness in America, the percentage of homes that where a father is not present. We see that concurrent with the rise of spiritual skepticism and people, kind of moving away from organized religion and so forth. I'm not saying there's a direct correlation, but it makes me question whether or not that might be a factor in America drifting away from God, the sense that there's an increased fatherlessness in our country.
Well, I know you know William Lane Craig fairly well,
Sure.
and have interviewed him. I grabbed a quote of his the other day. Don't know exactly how I got to it. It's kind of long, but I'd really like your analysis of it.
Yeah.
Because I think it goes to the other aspect of what you were just talking about. And Craig says, I firmly believe, and I think the bizarro, meaning crazy, testimonies of those who have lost their faith and apostatized bears out, and here's the key, that moral and spiritual lapses are the principal cause for failure to persevere rather than intellectual doubts. But intellectual doubts become a convenient and self-flattering excuse for spiritual failures, because we thereby portray ourselves as intelligent persons rather than as moral and spiritual failures.
Yeah, I mean, C.S. Lewis said, the person who's prideful will, part of the pride is saying, well, I'm too smart for that. I've got too many objections. And you do flatter yourself with your supposed level of intelligence by being skeptical about spiritual matters. As Ravi Zacharias has said, there's virtually always, a moral dimension to a person's rejection of God. That is extremely common, and it's more than just intellectual questions. I think that can often, as Dr. Craig says, be a smokescreen to hide real reasons a person is running from God and doesn't want to be held accountable morally for their lives.
Yeah.
It's a convenient way of puffing yourself up at the same time that you push yourself away from God.
This is Dave Garrison. We're here with this week's guest, Lee Strobel, and we'll return after a few messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
This is Dave Garrison, and we return now with this week's guest, Lee Strobel, and continue our discussion. Well, not wanting to be a spoiler for this movie, God's Not Dead, which, frankly, I think it's the best one that I've seen that's been in the theaters.
Yeah, when I saw the rough cut, as I say, quite a while ago, and it's an excellent film.
And they're fourth in the box office of movies in the theaters right now, and I just read that they've set the all-time record for movies in less than 1,000 theaters.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, I know, and I hope that does something. And Rick Santorum has called, asked for a meeting with myself and the president of the university and some others here locally, because he's now the CEO of Echolite Films. And, I think the film media is something that we really need a lot more of. And a movie that really, the whole principle is apologetics, like you and I were talking about, is really good. So that brings me to another thing that you've done, and it's a mnemonic, which I've taught a lot of people, and that's the 4 E's.
Yes.
Would you cover those? I know it takes a little bit of time, but listeners, please pay attention to this. Now I'm sounding like a professor. Please pay attention to this, because these 4 E's will stick in your mind, and when people come to you and talk to you, you can pull these out of your toolkit. And I think, Lee, if you go ahead and cover those, that'd be great.
Yeah, the 4 E's refer to the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I actually, when I interviewed Dr. Gary Habermas, who I know you know, who's a great resurrection scholar for my book, The Case for Christ, he likes to use 3 E's. So just to show him up, I like to use 4 E's.
There you go. I'll come up with 5.
Yeah, actually, sometimes I do use 5. Sometimes I use 6. But,
okay, all right.
But I usually keep it to 4.
All right.
But so the evidence for the resurrection, which of course, as we said earlier, is the linchpin of the Christian faith. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then there is no Christian faith. The first E is for execution, that Jesus was killed by crucifixion. And, the evidence for that essentially is so strong because, when we study ancient history, we're lucky if we have 1 or 2 sources to confirm a fact. And yet for the execution of Jesus, we not only have multiple early reports of this in the documents that make up the New Testament of the Bible, but we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible that confirm and corroborate it. And we've got Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar Serapion. Even the Jewish Talmud admits that Jesus was executed. The evidence, in fact, is so strong that the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, said Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. So, as a historical fact, the death of Jesus on the cross is as the atheist scholar says, simply indisputable. Secondly, the second E stands for the word early. Early reports. We have early accounts that Jesus rose from the dead that come virtually immediately after the event. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend, and it took a long time for legend to develop in the ancient world. In fact, A.N. Sherwin-White, the great classical historian from Oxford, said that the passage of 2 generations of time in the ancient world was not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So there was some time was needed for legend to develop, and yet, for the resurrection of Jesus, we have preserved for us a creed of the earliest church that affirms that Jesus died for our sins, was buried. On the 3rd day, he rose again from the dead, and then it mentions specific people and groups to whom he appeared, including a skeptic, and this creed is then affirmed by Paul, who himself was an opponent of Christianity, as Saul of Tarsus. Now, what's important about this creed is that it's been dated back by scholars to within literally months of the death of Jesus. In fact, James D.G. Dunn, who's one of the great classical historians, said this tradition, this creed, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a creed within months of Jesus' death. So we have a very early report, in fact, so immediately after the death of Jesus, that it cannot merely be attributed to being a legend. Then the 3rd E is for the word empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us Jesus' body was laid in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. It was sealed. Matthew tells us it was guarded, and yet it's discovered empty on the first Easter morning. Now, we could talk for a long time on the various strands of evidence that establish the empty tomb. But to me, the strongest fact is that even the opponents of Jesus and the enemies of Jesus implicitly admitted that the tomb of Jesus was empty. Because when the proclamation came from the disciples that Jesus had risen, they never said, baloney, go check out the tomb, you'll find the body. Instead, they said, oh, well, the disciples stole the body. Yeah. Well, that's a cover story. They're implicitly admitting the tomb's empty, but they're trying to explain it away. It's like a student comes up to you as a teacher and says, the dog ate my homework. Yeah. He's admitting I don't have my homework, but he's trying to explain what happened to it. Yeah. And similarly, we have from sources inside and outside the New Testament that the opponents of Jesus were saying that the disciples stole the body. So to me, that they're implicitly admitting the tomb's empty. And the cover story itself was ridiculous because the disciples didn't have the motive, they didn't have the means or the opportunity to steal the body. So we have an empty tomb, and then we've got, I think, the strongest evidence, which is for the last E, which is eyewitnesses. As I said, usually from ancient history, we're lucky if we have 1 or 2 sources to confirm a fact. But for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming and corroborating their conviction that Jesus appeared to them. I mean, that is an avalanche of historical data. In fact, it is so much data that even the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, said it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Now, he would attribute those appearances to being hallucinations or vision. And I think the evidence is too strong against those possibilities. So I think we've got these four E's: the execution, the early accounts, the empty tomb, and the eyewitnesses that make a really strong case that Jesus backed up his claim to being the Son of God by returning from the dead.
Then the other two things that I heard you add to this, one was about the women discovering talk about that for a second.
Yeah, that's another reason why we know the tomb of Jesus was empty. It's very interesting that when historians are trying to determine whether an ancient record is telling us the truth, one of the criterion they use is called the Criterion of Embarrassment.
Yeah.
And how it works is, if the writer of this ancient account is telling us something that is embarrassing to themselves or hurts their own case, they're probably telling the truth. Because if you're going to make something up and just invent something and lie about something, you'd never say something happened if it was embarrassing to yourself. Well, in the case of Jesus' empty tomb, it was women who discovered the tomb empty. And we know that in first century Jewish and Roman culture, the testimony of women was generally not considered to be reliable or trustworthy or credible.
Or admissible in court.
Josephus in the first century said, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted."
Yeah.
The Jewish Talmud says any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer.
Yeah, which we don't hold anymore, right?
No, of course not. But why would the writers of the Gospel say that women discovered the tomb empty when it would hurt their case? And it did hurt their case. In the second century, we have opponents of Christianity who opposed it by saying, "Well, you can't trust women. They discovered the tomb empty." So if they're going to make something up and invent the story that the tomb was empty, they would have said that John discovered the tomb empty or Peter discovered the tomb empty. They wouldn't have said that women discovered the tomb empty. So that's another way that I think we can have confidence that they're telling us the truth, because that's what happened, and they're just letting the chips fall where they may.
Well, now the other one that I'm going to ask you about became a math problem in one of my classes. I always open my classes with a devotional, and a lot of times we look at various apologetics issues because I want them to be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
And the number of eyewitnesses, and I heard you share this, and then being called on the witness stand, I made them calculate that. But go ahead and tell the listeners about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that the earliest report we have about the resurrection, and the one that is so historically credible that even the Jewish New Testament scholar Pinchas Lapid said it may be taken as a statement of eyewitnesses. That account tells us that Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. And then it adds, by the way, if you don't believe us, they're still alive, most of them, go talk to them, they'll tell you, which you don't say unless you're really confident that that's what happened.
Right.
So we know that when you add it all up, Jesus appeared to more than 515 at a minimum eyewitnesses. If you were to bring each one of those people to the witness stand and allow them to testify and be cross-examined for just 15 minutes each, and we sat here around the clock, we'd be sitting here for 5 straight days listening to eyewitness testimony. It'd be something like, 126 straight hours of eyewitness testimony about the resurrected Jesus. It's hard to say who would walk away a skeptic after hearing all of that evidence.
And not to be political, but I mean, we can't get one person to Lois Lerner to come to Congress and explain what happened with the IRS, and they want to believe the testimony of one witness, let alone 500.
Right, and the difficulty among the disciples of maintaining a story if it wasn't true. As Chuck Colson used to say, who of course was convicted in the Watergate scandal and became a Christian. He used to say that the Watergate conspirators couldn't keep a secret for very long.
Right.
Surely the disciples, if they were making this stuff up or lying, would have broken under the suffering and even martyrdom that they were going to experience. We've got 7 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming that the disciples were willing to suffer a great deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus rose from the dead.
Well, you mentioned something that's been very important for me, and that was that conference you had at Focus on the Family.
Yeah.
And I bought those recordings off of iTunes,
cool.
And I've encouraged so many other people to buy them off of iTunes. I think that that's connected, and I played it for college students here. hundreds of college students here at OCU. And that, to me, was a very, very good conference. The things that particularly you had to say, Del Tackett, Gary Habermas, I think, was there also. I think Frank was there.
Turek, I think, was there.
Yeah, and about the one thing that, and I'm going to ask it as a question, do young people really care about the truth? Because I've heard professors at other universities feel like they don't, and other adults that I know. What's been your experience?
Well, I believe they're very interested in this stuff, and we saw that at that conference you referenced where we had an overflow crowd of teenagers and young people there, and I was so impressed by their curiosity and their desire to learn. But, Dave Kinnaman, who's a researcher, did a book called You Lost Me, where he interviewed 5,000 young people.
And we've interviewed him on the show about that book.
Okay, so you know Dave, and he's a great guy.
Fantastic.
This is what he says in that book. He says, this generation wants and needs truth, not spiritual soft serve. This is a generation hungry for substantive answers to life's biggest questions.
Absolutely.
So, yes, I think that young people are interested in this and are willing to dialogue about it and have conversations. That's why this thing you mentioned earlier of small groups for people willing to discuss these issues are so popular. Because I think young people want to express an opinion. They don't want to be preached at, but they want to learn and they want to ask questions and they want to explore. And I think that's a great opportunity for us to engage with them.
You bet. And I've had students in class here, and we've talked a lot about it, is sometimes they have a hard time making an argument, although they have a thought. We try to assist them, and I tell professors this all the time. When you have a student who disagrees, help them argue their point. Yeah. Because we need that in class. But here's something, I know we're short of time, and I wanted to get to two other things real quickly. There's a group called the Right Wing Watch, and they track a little over 100 conservatives, what they say and do publicly. And I was interviewing Dr. Stephen Meyer, who I know you've interviewed. I think it was in the Case for the Creator.
Right.
Out there at Discovery Institute. And he's got these people that watch everything he says and does.
Right.
Are there people out there that do the same thing for you?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Like infidels.org and some of those people?
Yeah. I mean, they're constantly trying to find a slip-up or, and when you're talking as much as people often in the public eye do on radio, figures. Off the top of your head, responding to questions or in a public forum, you're gonna slip up every once in a while and misstate something by accident.
Yeah, just don't say the word asparagus.
Yeah, right. So it's understandable, but there's a lot of that going on, and of course today with the internet, everything gets preserved and amplified around the world.
Well, what troubles me with those, and when I ran for Congress, I got a lot of that, and I still get some because of the talk show and the university I'm at. Very rarely any attack is anything but an ad hominem, a personal attack and name calling. And I show this to students over and over again, and they've gotten to where, Ray Comfort that does the living water stuff, he's shown that over and over again. And I haven't quite figured out what's going on there, but I appreciate people like yourself who get attacked like that, who stand there for the cause of Christ, and I just wanted to commend you for that.
Well, thanks. And we all make mistakes. There's, there's things that sometimes we'll quote that turn out later discoveries to have marginalized or even disproven a claim in the past, and that happens. And
that's why you have new editions of a book,
That's true. That's true. In fact, we're doing a 15th-year anniversary edition of my book, The Case for Christ.
Wow, it's been that long.
We'll be updating some of that material.
Wow, that's great. I'm glad you're doing that, and we'll put up a link to your books and to your site and everything that we've mentioned here.
Great.
And the last question, a little bit more upbeat. You've written on a lot of different subjects, and you've written the fiction. What do you like to write about most? What is the most fun?
I like to really investigate a topic. And when I was a reporter, I love to pursue a story. And I pursued some big stories back then. One of the big ones I did was on the Ford Pinto scandal involving
I remember
that case, and I broke some secret documents from.
I remember when you did it.
Remember? Yeah, that was. I mean, I love pursuing a story, and similarly in the area of apologetics, that's what we're doing. We're pursuing a story. We're building a case. We're seeking evidence. We're looking at both sides of the issue and trying to come up with the most logical and rational responses. And so I find that to be the most fun when I do a case book, kind of building a case for a particular aspect of Christianity. My next book that'll be coming out on March 1st of next year is called The Case for Grace. And I look at the issue of grace and explore the evidence for changed lives and how God transforms lives in ways that only He can do. And so I love pursuing stuff like that and writing those kind of books. Although I got to say, I did enjoy writing the novel, and the fiction was a lot of fun. Just making something up. My daughter, as I said, is a novelist. And she challenged me and said, "Dad, you should try it. You'll enjoy it. You've been tied to the facts your whole life as a journalist. Let your mind go and just make something up." And it was a lot of fun, actually.
Well, I think most of us admire anybody that's written a book. The one I've been working on for some time is called Tell Me It Ain't So. And just about the time I get a chapter and things in the right place, something happens and changes it all. Something crazier happens. So I guess that's my rationalization. But Lee, thank you so much for being on the show today. We appreciate it. And as I said earlier, and I'm going to repeat it again, you have really changed the face of apologetics. You are, in most Christians' mind, the premier apologist. And the work you've done for the cause of Christ has been amazing. It's touched my life. And I can ask anybody here at the university, have you heard of Lee Strobel? And they all have. And that's a remarkable way that God has used you. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff, and thanks for the kind words. I appreciate what you're doing there, and God's blessing on you and all the listeners.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of our host, Dave Garrison, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show today. For additional information about the show, please go to faithandliberty.org, where you can access previous shows, like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page, and access other resources. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If the show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. The opinions and comments represent the views of our speakers and may or may not represent the views of Ohio Christian University. May God bless you, and thank you for listening to our show.